Welcome, dear viewers, to an extraordinary journey through one of the most tumultuous and transformative periods in world history. The Crusades. Across these epic religious wars pitted Christian and Muslim forces against each other in a fierce struggle for control of the holy city of Jerusalem, leaving behind a legacy of heroism, tragedy, betrayal, and faith. In this immersive series, The Crusades, religious wars between Christians and Muslims for control of Jerusalem, we will explore the motivations, ambitions, and spiritual passions that drove kings, knights, and caliphs to battle. Through powerful storytelling, detailed historical reconstructions, and captivating visuals, we'll guide you through every major campaign, siege, and turning point. From Pope Urban II's rallying cry at Clermont to the fierce bravery of Salah ad-Din, the iron will of Richard the Lionheart, and the haunting end of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, every chapter unfolds a new layer of human conflict and divine conviction. So sit back, relax, and prepare for a dramatic, slow-paced, and deeply thoughtful historical odyssey. Whether you're a history lover or a curious soul, there's a place for you in this unfolding medieval epic. Let us begin in the winter of Wu. A chilling wind swept across Europe, carrying with it the voice of a pope determined to change history. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a sea of nobles and peasants, his words ablaze with holy fervor. God wills it, he proclaimed, a cry that echoed across kingdoms. His message was simple: liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control and receive eternal salvation. The Eastern Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had pleaded for help against the advancing Seljuk Turks. Urban saw more, an opportunity to unite Christian Europe, channel violence outward, and perhaps reclaim the Holy Land for the Church. His sermon lit a fire in the hearts of lords, knights, and peasants alike. Within months, tens of thousands, inspired by religious zeal and dreams of glory, began marching east. This was no ordinary war. It was a holy mission, blessed by the Church and fueled by apocalyptic hope. Men sold their homes, kissed their families goodbye, and took up the cross. Thus began the First Crusade, a movement that would reshape the medieval world. Jerusalem was far and the road ahead perilous, but the call had been made and Christendom had answered. Long before armored knights marched toward Jerusalem, a ragtag horde answered the Pope's call. Led by the fiery preacher Peter the Hermit, thousands of peasants, farmers, and zealots, many with no military training, surged east in what would become known as the People's Crusade. Peter, with wild eyes and unshakable conviction, preached in town squares and villages. His sermons drew crowds by the hundreds. Soon, this grassroots crusade, full of makeshift weapons and burning faith, swelled to tens of thousands. Families marched with livestock, children, and hope. But with no plan, no supplies, and no discipline, their journey descended into chaos. Along the Rhine, violence erupted. Jewish communities suffered horrific attacks by some crusaders who equated their mission with purging all infidels. These pogroms foreshadowed the darker impulses that would haunt the Crusades. Crossing into Byzantine territory, the People's Army clashed with local forces and strained resources. Emperor Alexios, shocked by their disorder, quickly ferried them across the Bosporus into Seljuk territory, hoping they'd move on. But it was a slaughter. At the Battle of Sivatot, the Seljuk Turks annihilated the untrained mob. The People's Crusade was over before it truly began, a tragic, bloody prelude to what lay ahead. As the People's Crusade ended in disaster, a more formidable force began to take shape. Unlike the chaotic mob that preceded them, The noble leaders of Europe's mightiest houses were assembling a true army. This was the Prince's Crusade, and it would change the world. Among the most prominent leaders was Godfrey of Bouillon, a devout Frankish noble known for his bravery and piety. Alongside him came Raymond IV of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and his nephew Tancred, each with his own motives, pride, and ambition. Their armies marched not as one, but in separate contingents, each lord commanding his own men, fueled by a complex mix of religious devotion, lust for land, and political gain. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, wary after the People's Crusade debacle, demanded oaths of loyalty from the princes before aiding them. Suspicion simmered between East and West. Nevertheless, as summer waned, these great lords crossed the Bosporus into Anatolia. Ahead lay hostile territory, scorching heat, and relentless enemies. But for the first time, Christendom was fielding a serious military campaign, led by kings and knights rather than barefoot preachers. The First Crusade had truly begun, and its leaders now stood poised for glory or ruin. The Crusaders' first real test came at the city of Nicaea, a vital Seljuk stronghold in western Anatolia. As spring bloomed in Itzenling Josati, the Crusader armies encircled the city's walls, initiating a brutal siege. Nicaea, ringed by formidable stone defenses and nestled beside a lake, posed a major challenge. Godfrey, Bohemond, Raymond, and others coordinated a land assault, while the Byzantine Emperor Alexios secretly arranged for ships to be dragged overland to blockade the lake, cutting off supplies. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, underestimated the Crusaders and had left the city with most of his forces. When he rushed back, he found the city surrounded and supply lines severed. He launched a counterattack, but the Crusaders, now seasoned and strategically coordinated, beat him back. After weeks of bombardment, famine, and fear, Nicaea's defenders prepared to surrender. But to the Crusaders' fury, Alexios negotiated a secret deal. The city was handed over to Byzantium, not to the Crusaders. No looting, no pillage, no spoils. Though victorious, resentment festered. It was clear this alliance with Byzantium was one of convenience, not trust. Still, the road to Jerusalem lay open, and the Crusaders pressed forward. Flash from their success at Nicaea, the Crusader armies pressed deeper into Anatolia, but they would soon face their deadliest challenge. Yet, in the arid plains near Dorylaeum, the Crusader column, separated into two, was ambushed by the Seljuk Turks under Kilij Arslan and his allies. It was a bloodbath in the making. Bohemon's vanguard, moving ahead without the full army, was encircled by swift Turkish horse archers. Arrows rained down. Panic spread. The Crusaders formed a defensive circle, using wagons and shields to hold the line. Bohemond, ever the tactician, kept morale from collapsing. Messengers galloped through fire to reach the rear army. Hours later, Godfrey and Raymond's forces arrived like thunder. The tide turned. The Seljuks were forced to retreat. Defeated but not destroyed, the victory came at great cost. The Crusaders had learned that the Turks were masters of hit-and-run tactics, using ability and terrain to the... It also showed the necessity of unity. Had the armies remained divided, annihilation was certain. Dorylaeum was a hard-earned triumph, soaked in blood and dust. The crusade would go on, but with new caution and a deeper understanding of their foe, the unity forged in battle began to fray. Factions argued, tempers flared. Bohemond and Raymond clashed over strategy, and lesser nobles grew restless. The heat made even chainmail unbearable. Horses collapsed under riders, and wolves followed the trail of the dying. Yet amid the hardship, They pushed on, driven by faith and the promise of salvation. They passed burned villages and abandoned forts, reminders of Seljuk scorched earth tactics. Occasionally, the enemy struck, swift raids that vanished into the hills. Still, morale was not wholly broken. Bishops led prayers, and relics were carried to remind them of their holy cause. The bones of saints, crosses splintered from Calvary itself, these kept hope alive. By the end of Ichenling Joshurti, the Crusaders descended from the Anatolian plateau, battered but alive. Ahead lay the rich lands of Syria and the fortified city of Antioch. The First Crusade was entering its next phase, and its greatest siege yet. In October Ichenling Joshurti, the Crusaders arrived at Antioch, a sprawling fortress city guarding the path to Jerusalem. Towering walls, deep moats, and a strong Muslim garrison made it one of the most formidable strongholds in the Levant. Led by Bohemond, the Crusaders encircled the city, setting up siege camps. But Antioch proved stubborn. Its supplies were plentiful, and the defenders fought with resolve. Worse still, the Crusaders had no siege engines and no clear plan. Winter descended, turning the siege into a frozen nightmare. Food ran out. Men ate horseflesh and boiled leather. Many deserted. Morale waned. Disease swept the camps. Still, they held on. Bohemond began secret negotiations with an Armenian guard inside the city. Slowly, the Crusaders gathered timber to build siege towers and battering rams. A skeleton force of reinforcements under Tatikios, the Byzantine general, retreated early, widening the rift between east and west. As months passed, the enemy outside grew stronger. A massive Muslim relief army, led by Kerboga of Mosul, was gathering to crush the besiegers. Inside the Crusader camp, starvation and suspicion reigned. But Bohemond, ever scheming, had a plan. The fall of Antioch was near, but the worst was yet to come. After 8 agonizing months, Antioch's gates finally fell, not by brute force, but treachery. Bohemond had made a secret pact with Pharaoh, an Armenian tower guard, promising gold and power in return for betrayal. On the night of June 8, Joshua, under cover of darkness, Bohemond and his men scaled the walls, using ropes let down by Pharaoh. Once inside, they opened the gates. The Crusaders flooded in, and the city erupted into chaos. Antioch's defenders fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Yagi Siyan fled, only to be captured and beheaded by local tribesmen. The Crusaders, delirious with hunger and rage, massacred soldiers and civilians alike. Blood flowed in the narrow streets, but the victory was short-lived. The very next day, Kerboga's massive army arrived and surrounded the city, now occupied by exhausted Crusaders. Suddenly, the besiegers became the besieged. Panic set in. Trapped, starving again, and facing a far superior force, the crusade teetered on the edge of collapse. Then came a vision. A priest named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had found the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, buried beneath a church floor. The discovery inspired a last-ditch counterattack. With cries of Deus Vult, the Crusaders stormed out and miraculously routed Kerboga's disorganized army. Against all odds, Antioch was theirs. Victory at Antioch brought not unity, but division. Bohemond, who had orchestrated the city's capture, claimed it for himself. He refused to hand it over to the Byzantine Empire, breaking his earlier oath to Alexios. Raymond of Toulouse, outraged, accused Bohemond of treachery. The Crusader leadership fractured. Some demanded the campaign continue toward Jerusalem. Others insisted they consolidate their gains in the north. Meanwhile, famine persisted. Corpses still lay unburied. Disease festered in the heat. Morale plummeted as the summer sun beat down on the ruined city. Inside Antioch, tensions rose between Franks, Byzantines, and local Christians. Bohemond appointed himself Prince of Antioch, the first Crusader state, setting a precedent for feudal carve-outs. Though some knights left in disgust, most remained. The idea of Jerusalem still burned in their hearts. But for now, the crusade paused, entangled in politics, pride, and power. Raymond reluctantly led a faction southward, hoping to rekindle the holy mission. Behind him, Bohemond stayed to rule. Thus, even in triumph, the seeds of future Crusader rivalries were sown, not by the sword but by ambition, by early Itzenling Josejo. The Crusader army was battered, reduced in number, but still driven by a singular purpose: Jerusalem. With Bohemond left behind in Antioch, Raymond of Toulouse emerged as the reluctant leader of the remaining forces. Their path led south through Syria and into the Holy Land, passing through hostile territory, ruined cities, and parched deserts. Many Muslim towns surrendered or paid tribute to avoid conflict. Others resisted and were burned. Morale was lifted by the sight of the Jordan River, where many bathed and prayed, weeping in joy. For many, this was their first glimpse of the land of the Bible, a sacred milestone after years of war. At last, in June Itzenling Josejolt, the Crusaders beheld Jerusalem, a golden city on a hill gleaming in the summer sun, surrounded by high walls and determined defenders under the Fatimid governor, Iftikhar al-Dawla. The final leg of the crusade had begun. Their strength was fading. Supplies were low, but they had come too far, sacrificed too much, and shed too much blood to turn back now. What began at Clermont now stood at the gates of salvation, or damnation, on June 5th, Itzenling Josejo. The Crusaders laid siege to Jerusalem, their long-sought prize. The city, sacred to three great religions, was heavily fortified and defended by the Fatimid governor Iftikhar al-Dawla. The Crusaders, numbering fewer than Sherwu, Ling, faced formidable stone walls, limited resources, and a scorching summer sun. The army split to surround the city. Godfrey of Bouillon took the north wall, while Raymond of Toulouse occupied the south. The Fatimid defenders launched arrows and boiling oil from towers. The Crusaders, lacking siege equipment, were initially powerless. Desperation set in. The dry hills around Jerusalem yielded no timber, but soon Crusaders found dismantled ships near the port of Jaffa, dragged the wood inland, and began building siege towers and rams. Muslim sorties attempted to burn the constructions, but the Crusaders repelled them with grim determination. Meanwhile, the religious fervor intensified. A barefoot procession led by priests marched around the walls in penance. Prayers echoed through the camps as cries of Deus Vult rose with the heat. Inside the city, Iftikhar prepared for a final stand, knowing reinforcements would not arrive in time. Outside, Crusaders sharpened blades, fasted, and wept at the sight of the holy city. A final, brutal assault was planned. The blood price would be unimaginable, but so was the reward. On July Sherwu, Itzenling Josejo, after weeks of prayer, preparation, and unrelenting heat, the Crusaders launched their final assault on Jerusalem. Godfrey's siege tower, rolled into position under a hail of arrows, reached the city's northern walls. With shields raised and crossbows firing, Crusaders stormed the ramparts. Godfrey himself led the charge across the wall, sword drawn. The defenders fought fiercely, but the Crusaders surged in from multiple angles. Simultaneously, Raymond's forces created a diversion at the southern gate, drawing defenders away. As Crusaders poured through breaches in the walls, chaos consumed the city. What followed was a massacre. Driven by years of hardship, religious zeal, and revenge, The Crusaders slaughtered thousands, Muslim and Jewish alike. Blood reportedly flowed ankle-deep in the streets of the Holy City. Temples were looted, synagogues burned, and mosques desecrated. The Dome of the Rock, once a shining symbol of peace, was soaked in death. Only a few were spared. Atop the Temple Mount, Crusaders gathered, weeping with joy and disbelief. Jerusalem, the object of their pilgrimage and conquest, was theirs. The First Crusade had achieved its goal. Yet the victory was stained with unimaginable violence. The Holy City was taken, not with grace, but with fire and steel. Following the brutal conquest of Jerusalem, the Crusaders faced a new question: who would rule the Holy City? The crown of Jerusalem was offered to Godfrey of Bouillon, but he refused to be crowned king where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a symbolic gesture of humility, but also a clear assertion of power. Godfrey, devout yet pragmatic, moved quickly to stabilize the city. He organized garrisons, re-established churches, and designated priests to oversee holy sites. Pilgrims arrived, marveling at the blood-stained victory and seeking divine connection. Yet the wounds of the conquest were raw. Bodies still lay unburied, and smoke clung to the air. Godfrey's leadership was steady but brief. Disease struck the Crusaders, and many, including Godfrey, fell ill. Nonetheless, his influence endured. To the Christian world, Jerusalem had been redeemed, but to Muslims and Jews, the sack was a catastrophe. News of the slaughter traveled fast, sowing the seeds for vengeance and future wars. The Holy Land was now a Crusader state, but it would not remain in peace. As Godfrey settled into his role, enemies began to gather in the deserts beyond. The crusade had ended. The Crusader kingdom had just begun. Barely a month after capturing Jerusalem, the Crusaders faced a new threat. The Fatimid army from Egypt, numbering over Ursus, marched north to retake the city. Their target: to crush the Crusaders before they could consolidate power. Godfrey, though weakened by illness, rallied the remaining Crusader forces. At dawn on August Jur, outside the coastal town of Ascalon, the two armies met in open battle. The Crusaders struck first, taking the Fatimids by surprise. Knights, led by Godfrey, Raymond, and Tancred, charged the Egyptian camp in waves. Chaos broke out. The Fatimid camels stampeded, and their infantry broke ranks. Despite being outnumbered, the Crusaders' discipline and fury proved decisive. The battle was swift and brutal. The Fatimid army, unprepared for such ferocity, fled. Many drowned in the sea or were cut down as they ran. The victory sealed Crusader control over Jerusalem for now. Yet, curiously, the Crusaders did not occupy Ascalon. The city remained under Fatimid control, a decision that would later haunt them. Still, for one shining moment, Christian victory was complete. The Holy City was secure, and their enemies vanquished, at least for a time. With Jerusalem and Ascalon behind them, the Crusaders paused to breathe and bury. The First Crusade had cost tens of thousands of lives. Only a fraction of the original host remained. Yet their mission was accomplished. Pilgrims now trickled into the Holy Land, escorted by Crusader soldiers. Shrines were rebuilt and relics venerated. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was officially established, with Godfrey as its protector. Bohemond ruled in Antioch, Baldwin in Edessa, the First Crusader states, but peace was fleeting. The Muslim world, stunned by the fall of Jerusalem, began to rally. In Damascus, Cairo, and Mosul, leaders vowed revenge. Jihad was declared. Meanwhile, tensions brewed within the Crusader ranks. With Godfrey's health failing, questions of succession loomed. The church, though triumphant, was uneasy about the bloodshed. Europe rejoiced. Songs and sermons praised the heroes, but not all celebrated. Families mourned those who never returned. The crusade had created martyrs, monsters, and miracles. And though the first crusade was over, its embers smoldered. The holy fire would burn again. The road ahead promised more battles, more faith, and more fury. For Jerusalem was not the end, but the beginning of a centuries-long storm. In July 10 Ebite, just 1 year after the conquest of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon died suddenly of illness. The city mourned the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, but the power vacuum sparked a swift and decisive struggle for succession. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's younger brother and already Lord of Edessa, marched to Jerusalem with a force of loyal knights. Though Raymond of Toulouse had claims and support, Baldwin's military strength and political savvy won the day. Rejecting Godfrey's modest title, Baldwin boldly crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem on Christmas Day, Echen Ebite, a powerful symbolic gesture. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was now a monarchy, with Baldwin as its first king. Baldwin's reign would be marked by aggressive expansion and practical rule. He strengthened fortifications, secured trade routes, and launched expeditions to subdue rebellious cities and Muslim strongholds. His pragmatic leadership style prioritized survival over spiritual purity. He also encouraged European settlers to move to the Holy Land, laying the groundwork for a permanent Christian presence. Still, Muslim resistance was growing, and cracks in Crusader unity continued to widen. With Baldwin's coronation, the Crusader vision shifted from religious pilgrimage to empire building. With Baldwin crowned King of Jerusalem, the Crusaders shifted from conquering pilgrims to territorial rulers. Across the Levant, 4 major Crusader states emerged: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Each state was governed independently by a noble lord, bound loosely by faith and shared enemies. Baldwin ruled from Jerusalem. Bohemond and later his nephew Tancred held Antioch. Baldwin II presided over Edessa, and Raymond of Toulouse carved out Tripoli. These states resembled feudal Europe, complete with castles, fiefs, and knightly orders. Latin bishops replaced Eastern Christian clergy, and Western laws displaced local customs. European settlers established farming communities and trade ports along the coast. But maintaining these states was a constant struggle. Muslim neighbors launched raids, alliances frayed, and distance from Europe meant limited reinforcements. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders with suspicion, and internal rivalries often erupted into conflict. Still, fortresses like Crac des Chevaliers and castles at Acre and Beirut helped secure Crusader control. Pilgrims flowed into the Holy Land, protected by knightly escorts. The Crusader states had been born not just of zeal, but of steel and strategy. They were islands of Latin rule in a sea of hostility, and survival would demand endless vigilance. Herliebman, in Echen Ebiteling Sea, the Crusaders suffered their first major military defeat at the Battle of Haran, a harsh lesson in overconfidence and fractured leadership. Baldwin II of Edessa and Bohemond of Antioch had launched a joint campaign into Mesopotamia, seeking to expand their territory into Muslim-held lands. Initially successful, the Crusaders besieged Haran, but a swift and cunning counterattack by the Muslim emirates of Mosul and Mardin turned the tide. Using false retreats and ambushes, the Muslim armies outmaneuvered the divided Crusader forces. Baldwin II was captured, and Bohemond barely escaped with his life. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Crusader world. It ended any immediate plans for expansion east of the Euphrates, and exposed the vulnerability of the Crusader states. When acting without coordination, Harun also galvanized Muslim leaders, who saw that the Crusaders could be defeated through unity and strategy. It was a turning point. From this moment on, Muslim coalitions began to organize more seriously against the Latin presence. For the Crusaders, Harun was humbling. It reminded them that their hold on the Holy Land was fragile, and that victories, once frequent, would now be much harder to come by. In the wake of the Crusaders' conquest, the Muslim world, once fragmented, began to unite. The horror of Jerusalem's fall and the growing power of the Latin states ignited calls for jihad, a sacred struggle to reclaim Muslim land. Scholars and clerics urged rulers to set aside tribal and dynastic disputes. Though still divided, new leaders emerged with clearer visions. Among them was Imad ad-Din Zengi, governor of Mosul, who would later become a powerful unifier. Zengi rallied warriors under the banner of holy war, promoting the idea that defending Islam against the Crusaders was not only political, but divinely ordained. His speeches inspired fighters from Persia to Egypt. Military campaigns were launched not just in defense but in offense. Cities like Aleppo and Damascus, once wary of each other, began limited cooperation. Skilled commanders, siege engineers, and archers prepared for the day when the Latin invaders would face the full might of a revitalized Islamic world. The momentum was building. The Crusaders, unaware or dismissive, fortified castles, but remained politically fragmented. While Latin pilgrims still celebrated, the storm was gathering beyond the eastern horizon, and jihad would soon strike back in Ichen Ibait Ishurjol. Amidst the growing threats to Christian pilgrims and shrinking Crusader influence, a new order emerged, one that would become legendary: the Knights Templar. Founded by French knight Hugues de Payens and 8 companions, the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon was established to protect pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Initially humble, they were granted quarters in the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, Truf, Touz, believed to be on the site of Solomon's Temple. Hence their name. The Templars took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Clad in white mantles marked with a red cross, they became the warrior monks of Christendom. Unlike ordinary knights, they combined monastic discipline with military ferocity. Their fame grew quickly. Popes blessed them, nobles donated lands, and the order became wealthy and feared. Within years, they established a vast network of fortresses, banks, and training grounds across Europe and the Levant. They were more than guardians of the road. They became an elite military force in the Crusader cause, often leading charges. The founding of the Templars marked a new phase in the Crusades, one where religious war and organized institutions fused into something far more enduring and powerful. In June Ichenibite Iserjolt, the Crusader states faced a devastating blow at the Battle of the Field of Blood, also known as Ager Sanguinus. The Prince of Antioch, Roger of Salerno, marched north to confront an approaching Muslim force led by Ilghazi, the Artukid emir of Aleppo. Confident and headstrong, Roger ignored warnings and failed to wait for reinforcements from Jerusalem and Tripoli. He gathered his army near Sarmada, a hilly region thick with scrub, and encamped in a vulnerable position. Ilghazi, a cunning commander, waited until nightfall to launch his surprise attack. Under the cover of darkness, his forces descended upon the sleeping Crusaders. Panic erupted. With no time to form ranks or organize resistance, the Latins were slaughtered where they stood. Roger fought bravely, but was surrounded and killed. His severed head was later paraded through Aleppo. The massacre was so vast that the battlefield was said to be drenched in blood, hence the name. The defeat shocked the Crusader world. Antioch's northern frontier lay exposed. Panic spread across the Latin East, and calls for help were sent to Europe. The field of blood was not merely a military loss. It was a harsh reminder that Muslim forces were learning, uniting, and striking with lethal precision. Following the chaos at the field of blood, Baldwin II assumed the throne of Jerusalem and began a decade-long effort to stabilize and strengthen the Crusader states. A skilled warrior and pragmatic ruler, Baldwin II focused on fortifications, diplomacy, and religious institutions. He reinforced castles along key trade routes in borderlands, most notably the fortress at Montreal and the coastal port of Jaffa. His reign saw the development of feudal systems in the Latin East, ensuring military readiness and economic sustainability. Baldwin also worked to unify the Crusader nobility. Through marriage alliances and strategic patronage, he reduced internal conflict. He welcomed the Templars and Hospitallers, granting them lands and encouraging their expansion. One of his boldest acts was leading a campaign to rescue his own daughter, Melisende, who had been kidnapped by Bedouin raiders. He rescued her personally, cementing his image as both king and crusader. However, Baldwin's reign was not without strain. Muslim powers continued to grow stronger, and Jerusalem remained isolated. The fragile Latin kingdom needed support, and soon Europe would hear the call once more. But for now, Baldwin II held the Holy Land through grit, alliances, and a sword that never rested. In Ibn Arsati, a new figure emerged who would change the balance of power in the Crusader world. Imad ad-Din Zengi, appointed governor of Mosul and later Aleppo. Ambitious, brutal, and deeply committed to jihad, Zengi aimed to unite the Muslim world under his banner and expel the Franks from the east. Zengi began by consolidating power across northern Syria. Through marriages, military victories, and political assassinations, he forged alliances and subdued rivals. His charisma and ruthlessness earned both fear and loyalty. By Ibn Sisr, Zengi launched a daring siege of Edessa, the oldest Crusader state. The city, poorly defended and overconfident, fell after weeks of bombardment. Thousands of Christians were killed or enslaved. The Latin East was stunned. It was the first time a Crusader state had fallen. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves through Europe. For the first time since Itzenling Josejol, the very existence of the Crusader presence was in doubt. Zengi had opened a new chapter, one in which the Muslim counter-crusade would be defined not by defense, but by expansion. He died 2 years later, but his legacy passed to a greater warrior yet to come. The Crusaders had reason to fear, and Christendom began to stir again. The fall of Edessa in Ibn Sisr shook all of Christendom. In response, Pope Eugenius III issued a papal bull in Ibn Sisr calling for a new crusade. The Second Crusade. This time, the movement spread faster and wider, fueled by preachers like Bernard of Clairvaux, who mesmerized crowds with his fiery sermons. Kings and emperors now joined the cause. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany took up the cross, becoming the first monarchs to personally lead a crusade. Their decision elevated the campaign's prestige and raised expectations for swift success. Enthusiasm surged. Knights gathered in mass, and towns across Europe echoed with the sound of armor being fitted. However, the movement was again marred by attacks on Jewish communities, as some zealots misinterpreted the Crusade's purpose. By Ibn Sisr, the armies began their march. Two massive forces departed from France and Germany, bound for the Holy Land, determined to avenge Edessa and reclaim lost glory. But unity was fragile, logistics uncertain, and the enemy now far more prepared than before. The Second Crusade was grander than the first, but not necessarily wiser. The clash of kings and caliphs was about to resume. The Second Crusade began in disaster. Emperor Conrad III led the German army through Anatolia, retracing the route of the First Crusade. But the landscape had changed, and the Seljuk Turks were waiting. Conrad's force, numbering tens of thousands, was poorly supplied and ill-prepared for the Anatolian heat and mountains. The Seljuks, under Sultan Mesud I, launched continuous hit-and-run attacks, striking from the hills and disappearing before counterattacks could form. Ambushed repeatedly near Dorylaeum, Conrad's army collapsed. Thirst, starvation, and confusion turned the march into a death trap. Entire units were lost in canyons and forests. Conrad himself was wounded and forced to retreat to Constantinople. The failure shattered morale. Survivors were scattered and broken. The French army under Louis VII, still marching behind, would soon face its own hardships. The Germans' disaster showed that the Seljuks had learned from their past defeats. Anatolia was no longer a passage. It was a graveyard for the careless. And for the Second Crusade, the dream of reclaiming Edessa had already begun to fade. Following the German disaster in Anatolia, King Louis VII of France led his army south toward the Holy Land. But the road was no kinder to the French than it had been to the Germans. Crossing the mountains of Pisidia, the Crusaders were beset by rain, hunger, and constant harassment from Seljuk raiders. At Mount Cadmus, the French rearguard was ambushed, resulting in chaos and massive losses. Horses tumbled down cliffs, supplies were lost, and panic tore through the ranks. Louis himself narrowly escaped capture, climbing a rock and defending himself with sword and shield until rescued. The army limped into Italia, broken and demoralized. From there, Louis sailed to Antioch, leaving many soldiers behind. In Antioch, a new crisis erupted. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, Louis's wife, was warmly received by her uncle, Prince Raymond of Antioch. Whispers of scandal soon followed. Eleanor favored Raymond's strategy of attacking Aleppo, while Louis wanted to continue to Jerusalem. The royal couple quarreled publicly. Eleanor demanded a divorce. Louis refused. Political tension mixed with personal strife. The French crusade, once grand and promising, was unraveling. Though Louis would reach Jerusalem, his army had been decimated, and the unity of Christendom now lay in shambles. In June 1078, the surviving leaders of the Second Crusade met in Acre to decide their next move. Among them were Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany, and Baldwin III of Jerusalem. With Edessa lost and Aleppo too well defended, they chose to attack Damascus, one of the oldest and most prestigious cities in the Islamic world. The decision was controversial. Damascus had been a neutral city at times, even cooperating with the Franks. But now, the Crusaders saw it as both a strategic and symbolic target. In July, the joint army advanced on Damascus. At first, their assault on the orchards outside the city was swift and effective. But as they moved positions, confusion set in. Supplies ran short, the terrain worked against them, and reinforcements for Damascus began arriving. After just 4 days, the Crusaders called off the siege and retreated in disgrace. The campaign had failed utterly. Worse, the betrayal of a former ally enraged Muslim leaders across the region. Nur ad-Din, son of Zengi, used the Crusaders' aggression as proof of their treachery and rallied more cities to his cause. The Second Crusade led by kings and cheered across Europe, had ended in embarrassment. The dream of reclaiming Edessa was dead. The Muslim response was just beginning with the failure of the Second Crusade. A new leader emerged as the defender of Islam, Nur ad-Din, the son of Zengi. Charismatic, pious, and strategic, Nur ad-Din ruled Aleppo and Damascus, and his goal was clear: to unite the Muslim world and drive out the Franks. He launched a series of careful campaigns, reclaiming territory and securing alliances. Unlike many warlords before him, Nur ad-Din emphasized justice, religious devotion, and discipline. He patronized mosques, schools, and hospitals, building not just armies, but a legacy. In İçen-İbait Wushusus, he peacefully took full control of Damascus, uniting Syria under his rule. With Jerusalem in his sights, he avoided direct confrontation and instead weakened the Crusader states through attrition and diplomacy. His reputation spread. Even Christian chroniclers admired his fairness and humility. He refused personal luxuries, led Friday prayers, and ate with soldiers. Nur ad-Din's greatest legacy, however, would not be his conquests, but his mentorship. Among his military staff was a young Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din, destined to become the most famous figure of the entire crusading era. Under Nur ad-Din's leadership, the Islamic world found focus and purpose. The age of fractured emirs was ending. A new, unified resistance had been born after the death of his mother, Queen Melisende. Baldwin III took full control of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His reign marked a turning point in the history of the Crusader states, characterized by a mixture of promise and internal tension. Baldwin was young but intelligent and diplomatic, and he set out to strengthen the Christian hold in the Levant while resolving lingering disputes from the previous regency. In Thessaly, a major internal conflict had arisen between Baldwin and Melisende during the early years of his reign. Although mother and son had shared power since İçen-İbait Sisersan, tensions peaked in İçen-İbait Wushuar when Baldwin demanded sole rule. The kingdom was temporarily divided, with Baldwin ruling the north, from Acre and Melisende holding Jerusalem. Eventually, Baldwin's forces prevailed, and he was crowned sole monarch. Baldwin's rule was relatively stable, with efforts made to strengthen fortifications, expand the kingdom's influence, and maintain alliances with Byzantium. However, the kingdom faced continual pressure from Muslim powers, particularly from Nur ad-Din in Syria. Baldwin struggled to secure lasting military victories, though he achieved modest success through negotiations and campaigns. He married Theodora, a Byzantine princess, reinforcing ties with Constantinople. His diplomatic skills helped preserve the Crusader state in a time of growing Islamic unification. Despite his early death in İçen-İbait Loksasan, Baldwin III was remembered as a capable and respected monarch. In İçen-İbait Losurjot, the long-brewing storm of Islamic unity found its sharpest edge. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Saladin, appointed vizier of Egypt. Under the weakening Fatimid Caliphate, Saladin quickly became more than an administrator. He was a force of destiny. Saladin was Kurdish, raised in Nur ad-Din's court, and trained in both theology and warfare. Sent to Egypt to support Sunni power, he swiftly consolidated authority, purged corrupt officials, and reformed the military. Within 2 years, he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and pledged loyalty to Nur ad-Din's Sunni rule. But when Nur ad-Din died in İçen-İbait Wushusus, Saladin stepped forward. Through tact and skill, he claimed leadership of Egypt and parts of Syria. Some accused him of betrayal, others hailed him as Islam's savior. His strategy was methodical: unite Muslim lands, avoid rash battles, and only strike when victory was assured. He built alliances, trained armies, and instilled discipline. For the Crusaders, the most formidable opponent since the days of Zengi had arrived. Saladin wasn't just a warrior. He was a patient architect of empire, a master of both sword and soul. The Crusaders had splintered. Saladin was rising. The balance was shifting, and Jerusalem would soon be in his sights. In İçen-İbay Çizirsus, King Amalric of Jerusalem died unexpectedly while campaigning in Egypt. His death left the Crusader kingdom in a precarious position. His heir, Baldwin IV, was just 13, intelligent, devout, and already showing signs of a devastating illness, leprosy. Despite his condition, Baldwin IV displayed remarkable courage and political acumen. He ascended to the throne with the support of key nobles and ruled not as a figurehead, but as a warrior king. His illness, though debilitating, did not stop him from riding into battle, issuing laws, and managing court factions. During Baldwin's early reign, Saladin rapidly expanded his influence across Egypt and Syria. Baldwin recognized the growing threat and launched preemptive raids into Saladin's territory, scoring a surprising victory at the Battle of Montchizard in İçen-İbay Çizirsus. The Latin kingdom, however, was deeply divided. Noble families, especially the Ibelins and the Courtenay, vied for influence. The king's leprosy created succession uncertainty. Baldwin named his sister Sibylla and her young son Baldwin V as heirs, but rival factions pushed their own candidates. As Saladin's star rose in the Islamic world, Baldwin IV clung to power, his body failing but his mind sharp. He ruled until İçen-İbay Başçısı, defying fate and becoming a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. As Baldwin IV's leprosy worsened, internal rivalries consumed the kingdom of Jerusalem. The central figure in the emerging crisis was Guy de Lusignan, a French noble who married Baldwin's sister Sibylla, a union that would ignite one of the most divisive chapters in Crusader politics. Guy, ambitious but widely regarded as inexperienced and arrogant, was opposed by powerful barons like Raynald of Chatillon and Raymond III of Tripoli. Baldwin IV, wary of Guy's conduct, revoked his command after military blunders and excluded him from court affairs. Nevertheless, Sibylla remained loyal to her husband, deepening the court schism. To stabilize the succession, Baldwin IV crowned his nephew, Baldwin V, a child, as company king. But when both Baldwin IV and Baldwin V died within a year of each other, Sibylla seized the moment. In a swift and controversial move, she crowned herself queen and recrowned Guy as king against the wishes of many nobles. The kingdom was now dangerously divided. Some backed Sibylla and Guy. Others rallied behind Isabella, Sibylla's half-sister, and her husband, Humphrey of Toron. While the Crusaders quarreled, Saladin watched, patient and calculating. Their political weakness would soon be his opportunity for vengeance. Among the most reckless and controversial figures of the Crusader kingdom was Raynald of Chatillon, Lord of Outre-Jourdain. Bold and brutal, Raynald had long been a thorn in Saladin's side, launching raids deep into Muslim territory and breaking truces with impunity. In İçen-İbay Başçısı, despite existing peace agreements, Raynald attacked a Muslim caravan traveling through his lands, a convoy that allegedly included members of Saladin's family. He seized the merchants, looted their goods, and imprisoned the travelers, defying both diplomatic protocol and King Guy's authority. Saladin responded with fury. He sent messengers demanding justice. Guy, caught between his alliance with Reynold and diplomatic pressures, hesitated. Reynold refused to apologize. This brazen act gave Saladin the moral and religious justification. He needed to launch a full-scale war against the Crusaders. The call to jihad echoed through mosques from Cairo to Baghdad. Muslim forces rallied in great numbers. Reynold's defiance, applauded by some as heroic zeal, was seen by others as reckless madness. He had thrown a torch onto the powder keg of fragile peace. Saladin now prepared to strike, not just to retaliate, but to reclaim Jerusalem itself. The stage was set for the most decisive battle of the Crusades. On July 3, the Crusader kingdom suffered its greatest catastrophe at the Battle of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee. Saladin, responding to Reynold's provocation, had amassed a massive coalition of Muslim forces and laid siege to Tiberias, knowing the Crusaders would be compelled to act. King Guy de Lusignan, pressured by Reynold and other hotheads, marched his army across arid terrain to relieve Tiberias. Dehydrated and poorly supplied, the Crusader army became trapped on the plains near the Horns of Hattin, where Saladin's forces waited. Saladin ordered his men to set fires, choking the Crusaders with smoke and heat. Archers harassed them day and night. The next morning, the Muslim army encircled and crushed the Crusader host. The true cross, the kingdom's holiest relic, was captured. Thousands of knights perished. Guy was taken prisoner, along with many nobles. Reynold was brought before Saladin. Offered water as a token of mercy, he arrogantly refused to convert to Islam. Saladin personally executed him, fulfilling a promise to avenge his broken oath. The victory was absolute. The road to Jerusalem lay open. The Crusader army had been obliterated. The Holy Land would never be the same again. After Hattin, Saladin's forces swept across the Holy Land, capturing city after city. By October only Jerusalem remained, the sacred city, now virtually undefended. Inside the city, Balian of Ibelin, a noble who had once renounced war, took up arms to organize the defense. With only a few hundred knights and terrified civilians, he braced for Saladin's siege. The Muslim army encamped around Jerusalem. Saladin sent terms, surrender, and the people would be spared. Balian requested time, hoping to negotiate better conditions. Saladin, known for his mercy, agreed. After days of tense talks and a symbolic resistance, Balian surrendered the city. True to his word, Saladin spared the population. Christians were allowed to leave after paying ransom. Churches were preserved, and the Dome of the Rock was cleansed and restored as a Muslim shrine. Jerusalem had changed hands without massacre, a stark contrast to Ichenling-Josejul. Across Europe, the news caused shock and despair. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief. The call for a third crusade began almost immediately. But for now, Saladin stood atop the Temple Mount, victorious, prayerful, and resolute. Jerusalem, after nearly a century of Crusader rule, was Muslim once again. The fall of Jerusalem in Eitzen-Ebite-Bashit stunned Christendom. News of the disaster spread like wildfire. The papacy, monarchies, and ordinary citizens erupted in grief, anger, and a burning desire for redemption. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tromendi, calling for a new crusade, one larger, more organized, and worthy of restoring Christian honor. Across Europe, kings answered. Among them were three of the most powerful rulers of the age. Riddle died. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, fierce, bold, and deeply committed to the Crusader cause. Soeur Philippe of France, calculating and politically astute, though wary of Richard's ambitions. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, a seasoned warrior and legend among his people. This unprecedented alliance, known as the Third Crusade, promised unmatched might and prestige. But it was also plagued by rivalries and logistical challenges. Frederick's forces marched overland through Anatolia, but suffered tragedy when the emperor drowned crossing a river in Ebite Goses. His death shattered morale, and many Germans returned. Meanwhile, Richard and Philip set sail, their fates intertwined in a crusade unlike any before, one defined by epic sieges, tactical brilliance, and two of history's greatest generals facing off across the Holy Land. Quite the first major campaign of the Third Crusade was the Siege of Acre, a critical port city under Muslim control. Crusaders had already been besieging the city since Ebite Bashar Jot, but without coordination or leadership, progress was slow. In June, Ebite Josei, Richard the Lionheart arrived with his fleet, bringing renewed hope. Just days later, Philip II also landed. Together, the two monarchs revitalized the siege. Despite their mutual suspicion, they coordinated attacks, constructed siege towers, and launched bombardments. Inside the city, Saladin's forces resisted fiercely. Outside, Saladin harassed the besiegers with cavalry raids and supply disruptions. The conflict was brutal. Disease ravaged the Crusader camp, killing thousands, including Richard's own brother. Richard, though ill, personally led assaults and inspired his troops with unmatched bravery. On July Shara, Ebite Josei, Acre finally fell. The Muslim garrison surrendered, expecting safe passage, but diplomacy collapsed. Richard, enraged by delays in ransom payments and prisoner exchanges, ordered the execution of Tebite Muslim prisoners, a decision that shocked even some crusaders and would haunt his legacy. The siege was a hard-won victory, but one stained by blood. It marked the beginning of a war not only for territory, but for vengeance, pride, and survival. After the fall of Acre, Richard marched south along the coast toward Jaffa, a key port near Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed him, launching constant skirmishes to harass and exhaust the Crusader army. On September 5th, Ebite Josei, Saladin attacked in full force near the forests of Arsuf. His cavalry pounded the Crusader rearguard, aiming to break their formation. But Richard, ever the tactician, kept discipline. He ordered his men to hold formation. Despite overwhelming pressure, at the decisive moment, Richard launched a counterattack. The Knights Hospitaller and Templars charged in unison, catching Saladin's forces off guard. Richard himself led the central assault, sword flashing, shouting commands above the chaos. The Muslim line broke. Saladin's troops drew. Though not a total defeat for the Muslim army, Arsuf was a clear Crusader victory and a blow to Saladin's aura of invincibility. The battle cemented Richard's reputation as a battlefield genius. Yet he still could not reach Jerusalem. Saladin regrouped, and the war became a test of endurance and diplomacy. Arsuf was glorious, but it proved that victory alone wouldn't decide the fate of Jerusalem. Strategy, time, and resolve would. Despite victories like Arsuf, Richard the Lionheart never reached Jerusalem. Harsh terrain, supply shortages, and internal divisions among Crusader leaders stalled every advance. Saladin, though shaken, avoided open battle and focused on defending the city and draining Crusader momentum. In Ebite Josei, Richard reached within sight of Jerusalem, but turned back. He feared that even if he captured the city, holding it would be impossible without reinforcements and secure lines of supply. Morale faltered. Disease spread. Troops were exhausted. Instead of launching a final assault, Richard opted for diplomacy. After weeks of negotiation, he and Saladin agreed to a truce known as the Treaty of Jaffa. The terms were pragmatic, Fedius Dreish, Jerusalem, would remain under Muslim control. Peshti traced Tesht Christian pilgrims would be granted safe access to holy sites. Ice-Curie coastal towns, from Jaffa to Tyre, would remain in Crusader hands. Neither side achieved complete victory, but both claimed moral success. Richard returned to Europe, hailed as a hero but secretly disappointed. Saladin, though retaining Jerusalem, was financially and militarily drained. The Third Crusade had ended in compromise, not conquest, but it had preserved the Crusader presence and kept the dream alive for future generations with the signing of the Treaty of Jaffa in Ichen-i Joshirar. The Third Crusade ended, but the age of crusades was far from over. The battle for Jerusalem had become more than a territorial war. It was now a symbol of spiritual, political, and cultural struggle between two civilizations. Saladin died in Ichen-i Joshisan, praised for his mercy, leadership, and vision. Richard died in Ichen-i Joshiot, admired for his courage and military brilliance. Their legendary rivalry became myth, chivalry against jihad, lion versus crescent. In the following centuries, new crusades would be launched: the Fourth, which disastrously sacked Constantinople; the Fifth and Sixth, which briefly reclaimed Jerusalem; and the ill-fated Children's Crusade, lost to tragedy. But none would match the grandeur or clarity of purpose seen in the First and Third. The Crusades left enduring legacies, fortified castles, deep religious divisions, and evolving military tactics. They also sparked cultural exchanges, trade networks, and the eventual awakening of Europe's Renaissance. Yet at their heart, they were wars of faith, often driven by piety, often twisted by ambition. Jerusalem, sacred to three religions, would remain contested, a city forever at the center of humanity's search for meaning, redemption, and peace. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the epic saga of the Crusades, a turbulent and unforgettable chapter in human history. We've walked beside kings and caliphs, knights and peasants, monks and mercenaries, across deserts, battlefields, and the sacred streets of Jerusalem. This series has explored not only battles and conquests, but the deep faith, hope, fear, and ambition that drove entire generations to risk everything in the name of God. The Crusades were not merely wars of religion, they were crossroads of culture, power, identity, and destiny. They gave rise to heroes and tyrants, forged alliances and betrayals, and forever altered the course of Christian and Muslim worlds alike. And while these wars may seem distant, their echoes still shape our modern world. In the city of Jerusalem, in interfaith relations, and in the legacy of East and West, we hope this series has inspired you to reflect, learn, and look beyond the myths to the human stories behind the armor and banners. If you found this journey meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe for more immersive historical storytelling. Until our next adventure, may peace be with you, always.